The wreckage of Pan Am Flight 103 scattered across the Scottish countryside as the victims are remembered at memorial services and officials deal with troubling questions.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. By now, most of the world knows that when Pan Am Flight 103 crashed into the Scottish village of Lockerbie, all 259 people on board the 747 and perhaps as many as another 32 on the ground were killed. What we don't know for sure tonight is why they died and how. In this special edition of Nightly News, we'll attempt to answer the dark questions surrounding this tragedy. Was it sabotage by terrorists? Was a warning about an attack on Pan Am mishandled by authorities? And just who is responsible? Some of the answers, of course, can be found in the debris of the Maid of the Sea, as the 747 was called. It's scattered across the quiet countryside of southwest Scotland. And tonight, teams of investigators from the British and U.S. governments, Boeing Aircraft, and Pan Am are attempting to find the clues. NBC's Robert Hager in Lockerbie.
Investigators got their first good look at the wreckage today and said it indicates to them that this plane was brought down by either a bomb, a very large bomb, or by a sudden and massive structural failure of the plane's fuselage. And there are indications that of those two theories, a bomb is the more likely one. There are also indications by the position of the wreckage that whatever happened to this plane may have started about in here, an area of the plane where a cargo hold runs underneath. By dawn, it was evident to investigators just how widespread the wreckage was. Scattered through the village of Lockerbie and for 10 miles around. Authorities now say 259 aboard the plane died. Some of the bodies hit with such force, they left holes in the ground. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher toured the wreckage this afternoon.
Again, it is beyond anything in one's experience. The area over which parts and small pieces of twisted metal are scattered. Here, as you know, well, you can see.
But the fact that the debris was scattered indicated to investigators that the plane had broken up at high altitude, and that the explosion, if that's what it was tremendous. But at the same time, the nose, cockpit, and forward part of the fuselage was all found in one spot. That's what makes investigators believe that whatever occurred may have been centered just forward of the wings. A playback of tapes of radar at the time indicates that when the plane's blip first broke up, radar then picked it up falling in several pieces. That supports a bomb theory, because structural failure normally occurs less suddenly, giving some warning before it results in a complete breakup. Also, playback of audio tapes of the plane's communications with air traffic controllers indicates only routine communications, the last just 10 minutes before the plane broke up. The plane's flight data recorder was recovered this morning. It measures altitude, speed, and other information about the plane's performance. The cockpit voice recorder, which picks up the crew's private conversation in the cockpit, has also been recovered. Both are being analyzed. The plane was 18 and a half years old, 15th oldest in the world's fleet of 865 747s. Just last year, a 16-inch crack had been found and repaired in a bulkhead in the fuselage. In any event, a closer examination of individual pieces of the wreckage, just the way they are bent or singed, should go a long way toward saying whether this was a bomb or a structural failure. And again tonight, bomb is the leading theory. Robert Hager, NBC News, Lockerbie, Scotland.
Following the crash, there was the startling news that on December 5th of this year, an anonymous caller to the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, warned that there might be an attack on a Pan Am flight out of Frankfurt, West Germany. Flight 103 began yesterday in Frankfurt, stopping in London to change aircraft. NBC's John Cochran tonight on how that warning was handled by the State Department and aviation authorities. He's at the White House. John?
Tom, U.S. officials freely admit receiving that call in Finland, but they say they still don't know whether the tipster really knew anything.
According to the caller, an unidentified person in Helsinki would unwittingly take the device to Frankfurt and eventually onto the U.S.-bound flight. We receive dozens of threats each day. We always take them seriously. In this case, we took action immediately.
The action was this warning to U.S. government workers in Europe, a warning that a Pan Am flight from Europe could be a target. But the general public was not alerted. Why? Well, I don't have an answer to that, said White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater, adding, however, that he was not blaming anyone. Privately, U.S. officials say one reason they gave no public warning is that Finnish authorities said the tipster was a known crank. Vice President Bush talked in general terms about crackpot phone calls the U.S. often receives.
I've found from some experience in the intelligence business that you get enormous numbers of suggestions that there's going to be some kind of terroristic action, and most of them never materialize.
Pan Am did take the threat seriously and says it stepped up security even though bomb threats are not unusual.
Over the years, you see there are always some silly persons who bring us up and tell us there's a bomb or somewhere. See this happen.
U.S. officials say airports would have to shut down if the public was alerted to the dozens of bomb threats received every day. It all depends, they say, on how serious the threat seems to be.
I can certainly imagine cases where it would be appropriate for us to warn American travelers, and you may be assured that we would do it.
FBI Director William Sessions said there should be a reevaluation of whether enough notice is given to the public about terrorist warnings.
And tonight there is still no clear explanation for why government workers were given advance warning but not ordinary travelers. But even with the warnings, 3 State Department officials took the fatal flight. 2 were diplomatic security agents who apparently were satisfied with the extra security laid on in Frankfurt. Tom?
Thanks very much, John Cochran at the White House tonight. I'll be back in a moment with a report on the group claiming responsibility and a possible weapon. It's called Plastique. Was the crash of Flight 103 a bombing, revenge for the shooting down by the USS Vincennes of 290 on board an Iran Air jetliner last summer? Well, a caller to news agencies in London today claimed that the tragedy was the work of the guardians of the Islamic Revolution. The crash, he said, was a heroic execution in revenge for the blowing up of the Iran airplane by America a few months ago, adding, quote, "We are very proud." NBC's Fred Francis in Washington tonight reports that once again, U.S. officials are trying to match up terrorist groups with terrorist tactics. Fred?
Tom, the suspects are a who's who list of the nation's enemies, from Gaddafi to the Ayatollah. But tonight, U.S. intelligence agencies have more hunches than hard leads on who had the means to destroy a plane full of Americans. That group, the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution, is a name used in the past as a front for Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Many defense officials believe they are the prime suspects. The officials point out that the Guards promised revenge for the U.S. Navy's accidental shooting down of an Iranian Airbus last July. That tragedy killed more than 200 Iranians just 4 days before an Islamic holy day, just as the Pan Am flight crashed 4 days before Christmas. The most frequently mentioned individual terrorist is Abu Nidal, the radical Palestinian who has even vowed to kill Yasser Arafat. In recent weeks, U.S. intelligence agents have received reports that Nidal planned a terrorist attack to embarrass mainstream Palestinians who voted on a moderate policy last month in Algiers. Experts pointed out that the anonymous caller to the Helsinki embassy earlier this month implicated Abu Nidal. But bombing a plane is not Nidal's trademark. He has ordered slaughters at airports and synagogues. He has not demonstrated the expertise to down an airliner yet. Islamic Jihad, a Lebanese Shiite gang, has also claimed responsibility for the 747's destruction. Islamic Jihad is one of the names used by those holding Americans hostage in Beirut. Lebanese Shiite terrorists have hijacked and destroyed planes. Tom, the list is much longer, but tonight, put simply, the U.S. government just doesn't know.
Fred Francis, what happens if they identify the group? What can the United States do in response?
Extraordinarily difficult, Tom. Earlier this year, Japanese terrorists bombed a USO club in Naples, Italy, on the anniversary of the U.S. raid against Tripoli. And though everybody in this government believed that Gaddafi was responsible, we couldn't prove it. Very difficult to get fingerprints from 31,000 feet.
Thank you very much, Fred Francis, at the Pentagon tonight. Well, if terrorists did plant a bomb on board Flight 103, they were able to evade security measures at 2 of the world's most secure airports. Any of you who have ever been to Frankfurt and London's Heathrow know what it's like there. However, as NBC's Brian Ross is here to tell us tonight, advances in terrorist technology have made detecting bombs an increasingly difficult task. Brian, what's the story?
Tom, American authorities are saying tonight that if a bomb was used to blow up the Pan Am 747, it was almost certainly a bomb made of C4 plastique, a hard-to-obtain, putty-like substance that cannot be detected by the security devices now in use at airports around the world. This is C4 plastique. Even a small amount has enormous power. 11 years ago, this plane, based in Houston, Texas, was used to smuggle 21 tons of C4 to Libya. This is the man who did it, former CIA agent Edwin Wilson, who is now in prison for his dealings with Libya and its leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Federal authorities say it was Wilson who sold Gaddafi what he wanted most, a huge load of C4 that has been used ever since in one act of terrorism after another. Les Coleman is an authority on terrorism in the Mideast.
Mr. Gaddafi obtained this huge amount of plastic explosives, and he is now in the position of being maybe the sole supplier of this kind of stable explosive to people who are willing to carry out these violent acts around the world.
Authorities say it was only a half pound of C4 that blew this gaping hole in a TWA jet over Greece. Authorities say this woman was able to blow up a Korean Air 747 by planting a Sony Walkman tape recorder loaded with C4 in an overhead rack. And in another incident involving C4, Israeli security guards in London found a molded sheet of the explosive in a carry-on bag that was set to be detonated by a small calculator. Explosives expert Dr. David Fine.
It can be molded, it's hard to detect, and it's a very powerful explosive. It's even more powerful and explosive than TNT.
The FAA is now trying to rush development of machines that can detect C4 by its smell. But so far, the machines have been used only on a test basis. Those acts of terrorism involving C4 that have been stopped not by machines, but by careful screening and surveillance of passengers by security personnel. And some executives in the airline industry said today that Pan Am does not do as much of this kind of security as do some other international carriers. Tom?
Thanks, Brian. I'll be back in a moment, and Connie Chung will be here on how the families and the friends of those who were killed are dealing with this loss. For the families and the friends of the people who died on Flight 103, this was a day without joy, a time beyond consolation. The bright lights of the holiday season only deepen their mood of despair. Tonight, NBC's Connie Chung tells us about them and the loved ones that they've lost.
A veteran pilot, the captain of the plane, a 20-year-old in England to teach primary school, and a college student. They were all coming home for the holidays when their relatives received the shocking news. Daniel Rosenthal, a Vassar College student. His mother said he worked 2 jobs to pay for his trip to England, where he taught school. She says he had a special bond with children.
The most profound loss to me is a relationship he had with a sister who was moderately retarded. Daniel took responsibility on himself when I had to work to come home from school every afternoon to play with her.
Captain James McQuarrie, father of 2, had worked for Pan Am for 24 years. One of his best friends, an American Airlines pilot, Skip Vaught.
The best thing I can say about him is he was a fighter pilot. He was one of the best, if not the best, and he knew it.
And Keisha Whedon, a 20-year-old college junior who was in England studying to be a social worker. Only 3 years ago, her parents had lost their son, a Harvard medical student, who died in a car crash.
She wasn't sick. She was a healthy girl, young, pretty, at the prime of her life, 20 years old. Didn't have anything to worry about, so it's no reason for her to die.
The grief for these families is turning to bitterness as they learn that Pan Am received bomb threats as early as 2 weeks ago.
I think if it was a warning and no one paid any attention, that was pure negligence.
As relatives wait for answers, they have only their memories.
I want to say that Daniel was an extremely valuable gift to me and to the people who have also loved him.
Connie Chung, NBC News, New York.
On the campus of Syracuse University, which lost so many students in this crash, today was for learning a different kind of lesson. As NBC's Bill Schechner reports tonight, this was a lesson about living.
They gathered in the university chapel today to remember those who never got home.
It hurts all the more. Why? Because the people who were taken from us were so young.
It is exam week here. The semester ends tomorrow, normally a happy time. This year, the death of 38 students returning from overseas has turned joy to grief and reminded young people that even here on this peaceful campus, they are vulnerable.
It scares me because it could happen. It could happen to anyone. It's something that you couldn't have prevented at all. It's just something out of our control.
As far as my living and dying goes, I have no control over that, and you feel really insecure and insignificant almost.
What are your feelings?
You're just reminded of your own mortality. You're reminded that you don't have to be old to die.
Some things have continued, like last night's basketball game. It included a moment of silence. By today, people were thinking how the campus could move from grief to healing.
I think for us it will be a matter of looking at the students that we've lost and remembering the times that we had with them that were good.
This tragedy demands answers. Here, they can only be found in the heart. Bill Schechner, NBC News, Syracuse.
And this story of the different fates of two travelers. Syracuse student Matthew Trento held a ticket for Flight 103, but he took an earlier flight which was booked by his mother, and he is home safe and alive tonight. However, Army Lieutenant George Williams was forced to take Flight 103 after missing an earlier plane because he was stuck in a traffic jam. In other news tonight, President-elect George Bush today filled 5 top-level jobs in his administration. He overruled the objections of anti-abortion groups to name Dr. Louis Sullivan as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Sullivan is the first black to be named to the Bush cabinet. Congressman Manuel Lujan of New Mexico was named Secretary of the Interior. Chicago transit official Samuel Skinner was named Transportation Secretary. Another Chicagoan, Edwin Derwinski, was named to head the new Veterans Affairs Department. And the president of the World Wildlife Fund, William Riley, was appointed head of the Environmental Protection Agency.
To my knowledge, this is the first time the leader of a major conservation organization has been appointed directly to the position of EPA administrator. And I think that fact in itself suggests how the president-elect views the work ahead of us.
A federal judge in Los Angeles today struck down key immigration laws in this country. Those laws allowed the U.S. government to deport aliens who belong to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and those who advocate world communism. The White House says that President Reagan is extremely concerned about a factory in Libya that is believed to be making chemical weapons, and he's even considering taking military action against it. But Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi says that the factory is making medicine. He warns he's prepared to defend it against any attack. The village of Lockerbie, Scotland. Safe to say that even most of the people in Scotland knew little or nothing of this quiet little town, celebrated locally for its cheese and woolen goods. But tonight, of course, the world knows of Lockerbie and the tragedy that struck so suddenly at its innocence. NBC's Mike Betcher tonight in Lockerbie.
Sounds from the hellish night continued into the day. Lockerbie, population 4,000, braced to deal with the aftermath of the disaster that fell from the night sky. Outside City Hall, townsfolk studied a list of the dead from their village. They were not just names, they were friends. At dawn, Raymond and Doran Kerr surveyed the village and the surrounding hills. They were looking for their aunt. They did not find her.
At the moment, we're just numbed, absolutely numbed. We've been out all night. We were up the hill trying to help. All we could find was bodies.
The emotional scars cut deeper than superficial wounds. Quiet, isolated Lockerbie concluded it was witnessing the world's dark side.
I'll let you know what's happening anyway.
David and Barbara Whittle saved their children by throwing them out of a back window of their house when the fireball came.
I mean, just before Christmas, it's just unreal. I mean, I don't know, there must be some sick people about in this world.
But this was not just Lockerbie's tragedy. The villagers wanted to reach out.
I would just like to say to the people of America who have lost friends and relatives in this horrible disaster, that please come to Lockerbie and the people will make you most welcome.
The heart was not ripped from this town, although it was hardened. Isolation did not protect it. Lockerbie believes it was forced into a dangerous modern age. Mike Betcher, NBC News, Lockerbie, Scotland.
The people of Lockerbie are the latest victims of the loss of innocence in this modern world. They chose to live in the spare countryside of southwest Scotland, in small bungalows with one main street, some old-fashioned shops, 300 miles from London and so much farther from the bitter feuds that have brought so much grief and death. And yet, they could not be secure in their isolation. If this was an act of terrorism, and we still don't know that for sure, of course, the people of Lockerbie are the latest to learn that there are no absolute sanctuaries from this madness. It's a war without rules or boundaries. And for all of the bravado on all sides, this is also a war without triumph. It is a war of victims, almost all of them innocent. That's Nightly News for this Thursday night. I'm Tom Brokaw.